sister-in-law today of us, but I don't think Joan did. I don't know.
Those watching the recording, welcome. We're going to get going here in just a minute as our live streamers and the rest of our in-personers make their way in. In-personers. Well, now that we have both live streamers and people in person, I suppose we need adjectives for the titles. I don't know. But welcome, who I'm assuming is Andy. I keep always, whenever the one pops up, I assume it's Andy. It might not be, and if you're not Andy, welcome. You are Andy. I just got your message. But if you're ever watching the live stream and I just say hello, Andy, and it's not Andy, that means you beat him in, which is impressive. Because I'm pretty sure he just sits on our Facebook page ready to go. He is on top of things. You will need Bibles. We have 2 references today, so not quite as many as last week, but we will be doing a little bit of biblical work here today. Before we actually dive into the class, we have some scheduling questions to answer for those of you who are really in person. You're going to get the say here. So originally, as far as the church schedule goes, next week is scheduled to be the last class. That being said, this class was delayed 1 week, and so I have 2 more lessons that I had in mind for this course when I put it together. So I am interested in what you guys think. We can either stick with the schedule or the lesson plan and outline. I'm happy doing either, so that you actually know what you're voicing opinions on. Today's class, we're going to look at the Humiliation and Exaltation of Christ. Next week, we're going to be looking at Christ's threefold offices. That's the prophet, priest, king thing, if you've ever heard that or if that rings any bells. And then that could very easily conclude the class. The last session was going to be kind of moving a little bit from Christology into soteriology and a little bit of homiletic kind of stuff. That's preaching. And we were going to take a look, or my plan was to take a look at salvation motifs. So how do we look at Christ's work of salvation? How does it apply to us? And what are different ways that we use to speak about that? I'm okay if we don't go with that class, because I'm going to give you some of my preaching secrets away, and so you'll be able to see through some of my sermons if we do that. But I'm also happy to add that back in and teach the full set, or just stick with the schedule. So thoughts, opinions from you guys, because if you're not here, I'm going to teach. So.
Well, I'd like to extend it and cover your
I'll
agenda.
Okay, well, see, Jeff said he showed up. He's going to show up, so now he is required to be here. Everyone else, it's an act of will, but Jeff. Okay, so we'll just extend it, so we'll have class next week, and then the following Wednesday as well. So, as of this moment, you got 3 more lessons. We're going to finish one of them today, so then 2 lessons remaining. So before we dive in, any questions from last week? Last week was a bit of a heavy-hitting class, as I've assured some folks who have taken it both in person and online. This is about as difficult as it gets. My mother actually asked me about the complicated stuff, and I said, I can only think of one other thing I did at seminary that was this complicated. And 95% of guys that go through seminary didn't even talk about that other thing, because you had to take certain electives with certain professors. The guy who made this chart actually is the one who did the other really complicated thing, and we would need to do a whole class on philosophy before we dove into that one, so that's not worth doing. And I might give away some more preaching secrets if I do that. I can't give all of the secrets away, right? I gotta keep something in the back pocket. But this is right. This 2 natures, the 3 genera, all of that is about as complicated as it gets. past this, and it just becomes incomprehensible in a very literal sense. Can't understand it. And so we would wash our hands of the conversation. So, any questions? Great. But just be assured, we've kind of crested the complexity hill, and we're going to be kind of riding things out on the way back down. But any questions, holdouts from last week? All right, cool. So this, as Wright and I and a few of us were joking beforehand, Wright asked if, are you ready for the exam today? And interestingly enough, if you were in the seminary, you were taking this as an actual course, this probably is when the exam would be. Certainly papers would be due at this point, because we're shifting to the second half of the class, if you will. For the past 3 weeks, we have focused on the person of Christ. If you'll remember from the first class, I noted that there are really two aspects of Christology. The one that very often gets talked about first, although it doesn't have to be first, it just tends to be the one spoken of first, is the person of Christ. Who is Jesus, right? You get into two natures Christology, all that good stuff. We're now moving into the second portion, which is the work of Christ. So we've dealt with who is Jesus. Now we're asking, what did he do? What is he doing, right? Because we'll note today, especially, that he's not done. Christ is still working even today. And so this is a shifting point. The personhood of Christ is in the rear view mirror, right? As we dealt with last week, because, even with the Gana monicum, right? We already started talking about how Christ, everything he does, the work is through both of his persons, or rather both of his natures. And so we've already started kind of morphing our way into the work of Christ. And we're definitely going to be referencing back to the person of Christ. You can't really separate the two. You cannot separate the person from the work. But we're going to be shifting our focus, our emphasis onto the work of Christ. And there are a number of ways in which we can do it. Personally, I tend to prefer, and it luckily lines up with how Pieper tends to outline things, which is probably not a coincidence. It's probably because that's how I was taught, and that's how I tend to look at things. We look at the humiliation and exaltation of Christ, which, if you haven't heard that term before, or that phrase rather, it will probably be familiar to you. And we're actually going to close out. You'll see, I'm very proud of this. Look, the back side of your sheet, that is formatted landscape, and the front is portrait, right? Did you know that you could do that in the same Word document, have both portrait and landscape? I learned that you could do it earlier this week. But we're going to be filling in that chart, essentially. It's a staircase, stair-step sort of model. Quite frankly, that's how I teach the confirmands. This sort of lesson is with that model. We're going to finish off with that, and it should serve to kind of really cement this. And hopefully you won't be able to say either of the creeds in church again without thinking about the humiliation and exaltation of Christ. And then, of course, the other aspect is what we're going to cover next week, which is that threefold office, that Christ is prophet, Christ is priest, and he is king as well. But today, we're focusing on the humiliation and the exaltation of Christ. And so, I'm going to start out, we're going to do general overview of what are we talking about? And then we're going to dive into the individual details. And Bill, you will be thrilled and ecstatic to find out that I have an asterisk on one of my things here just because of you in our conversation on the descent into hell, which we'll talk about in some detail today. Although Pieper goes into gory detail on the topic. We're only going to...
You'll make me sorry I asked that.
That's right, yeah. For those of you who don't know, Bill wrote a question about the descent into hell on our shameless plug here, the little half sheets about what you'd like to study next. Fill those out, bring them in. And so it just so happens that Bill asked about the descent into hell, so we're going to be diving... we're going to be diving into it anyway.
3 more Latin phrases.
I probably shouldn't say this because I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think there's any Latin today. At least not any new Latin. And if it's written down, I'll let you know. There's always a chance that the Latin comes out, right? I mean, as you know these things, right? The Latin can just come of its own accord. But I don't think I'm actually planning on any Latin for you today, Steve. So what is the humiliation and the exaltation of Christ? So we said that Christ kind of enters into, Christ kind of walks down steps of humiliation and up steps of exaltation during his work on earth. And of course, his work extends beyond that, really in both directions, right? Jesus was doing things, well, more specifically, the second person of the Trinity was doing things before the incarnation, right? He was involved in creation, right? In the beginning was the Word. And how does God create things? Or how does the Father create again? By his... Tom? By his Word, right? And we recognize that the agency of creation is the Son. Is the second person of the Trinity. The Father works through the Son, and the Spirit's over the waters. The Spirit's there too, right? So even though we assign the work of creation most properly to the Father, the Son is involved as well. I am of the opinion that anytime you see God in the Old Testament, whether it be the man walking in the cool of the day in the Garden of Eden, the fourth man in the midst of the fire, the pillar of fire and smoke, right? The cloud descending on the temple, the burning bush, all of that. Anytime you see God in the Old Testament, I'm of the opinion that you are looking at the second person of the Trinity. That's not a major topic for today's lesson, but the second person of the Trinity is doing things before the incarnation. And we're going to spend some time noting that he is still working to this day. But the humiliation is really the humiliation exaltation, for the most part, begins at, well, it does begin at the incarnation, and for the most part, it takes place during the earthly life of Christ, although that ceases to be true as we work our way through the exaltation. It'll all make sense when we get there. But a few notes before we continue here. In the state of humiliation, Christ retains the full use of his divine glory that is fully his according to the genus Majestaticum. And this does not count as Latin since we already covered it, so you can't knock me on this one, right? So in the state of humiliation, Christ refrains from the full use of the divine glory that is fully his according to the genus Majestaticum. And so what does that mean? Another way to think of it is that in the state of humiliation, the divine glory in Christ is concealed. Right? People don't look at Jesus and think, God! I mean, sometimes they do, but it's usually because he's revealed himself to them. The humiliation of Christ, this veiling and refusal of full use of the divine glory, is absolutely required for salvation. Christ willingly and was required to submit himself to the Father. That in and of itself is an act of humiliation. And we're going to talk about that in detail as we go. And without that willing and complete submission to the Father, then Christ could not have accomplished salvation. And so Christ willingly, in submission to the Father, humbled himself according to his human nature. Right, so this is some idiomaticum stuff going on here. And refrained from full use of his divine majesty so far as his being a servant required. So, does the divine majesty or the divine nature is it ever removed from the person of Christ? No, good. You got that, right? We've nailed that one down. So he still has the full divine majesty. However, in the state of humiliation, he does not use it, right? Probably a good place that we can kind of see this happening, where it makes sense to us. Two come to my mind. One is during the temptation, right? Where the devil says, throw yourself down, 1,000 angels will come and your foot won't strike the stone. The devil's absolutely correct, right? Whether he knows exactly who Jesus is or not, he's right, technically. right? Jesus, if he were to have cast himself down, not only would the angels have kept him from striking his foot against the stone, but if he was making full use of his divine majesty, wouldn't have mattered anyway, right? We also see this on the cross, right? He saved others, let him save himself. If he really is the Son of God, come down from the cross. We talk about this all the time. Could Jesus have come down from the cross? Absolutely. He willingly did not. He refrained from using his complete and total ability to remove himself from the cross and the suffering he had, and in humiliating submission, stayed there for us and for our salvation. So we see this veiling of divine majesty fairly regularly. We also will sometimes talk about this in the comparison and contrasting of the two advents of Christ. Right? So we talk about how in Christ in his first advent, right, when he came as a baby in the manger, no one knew. Right? The shepherds had an idea, that's just because they were told, but by and large, no one knew who Jesus was. No one knew that God was now lying in a manger. Right? The divine majesty has been veiled. Whereas in the state of exaltation, which we'll get to at the end, when Christ comes the second time, his divine majesty will be fully revealed, and everyone will instantaneously know exactly who he is, that he's here, the whole 9 yards. Right? So this is another place where we kind of see the veiling, the concealing of the divine majesty. Then, on the flip side, in the state of exaltation, Christ does begin to make full use of his divine glory. And it kind of begins to mushroom out, right? Which is, just as Christ becomes more and more humiliated, he becomes more and more exalted as he goes on. So, state of humiliation, he refrains from full use of the divine majesty. And in the state of exaltation, he does not refrain from that full use. As we go on, Pieper gives us a few summary points before we dive into things. 4 of them, or 5 rather, to be specific. The first is that when we talk about the humiliation and exaltation, this properly only applies to the human nature. The divine nature retains its glory throughout the entirety of Christ's ministry. It is the human nature of Christ that is humiliated and exalted, right? And a good way to see this, right, is that the divine nature always remains the same, but more is covered or revealed. That being said, right, the second point, Christ still possesses divine majesty from the moment of conception, right? That the genus myosoticum never stops. He never stops having any of the divine nature. We got that down. The humiliation, this is point 3, was not feigned. It wasn't fake. This is a real, actual humiliation of Christ, right? It's not, it's kind of like when we talked about Apollinarianism, or some of these hologram Jesus heresies, where it's like, oh, Jesus only pretended to die on the cross. Well, Jesus is only pretending to be humiliated, pretending to be in submission. No. It is a real, actual, and true humiliation. Point number 4. At no point does Christ renounce all use of his divine majesty. Right? So, again, this is a different way of saying, well, on the one hand, the divine majesty is still there, but also at no point does Jesus say, I'm not using it at all. Any ideas why this is so important? Why do we pay attention to this? Why do we make this distinction that at no point does Jesus completely conceal the divine majesty? Any guesses as to what Pieper is guarding us against?
We just think of him as anybody else.
Okay, yes, and most specifically, right, where does this all go wrong for people? Where do people get this all, the one place in Christ's life where people mess everything up? If they're going to mess it up, where is it? On the cross, right? We need to make very clear that even as Jesus dies and is buried, he still has his divine majesty. That divine majesty is dead with him, right, in an incomprehensible way, but the divine has not left. the divine has not been. It's not as if like Jesus closed the blast doors on the divine majesty so that it doesn't get hit with the explosion of death or whatever, right? No, the divine majesty is still there with Christ the whole time. However, during the humiliation, the divine majesty was limited, and then during the exaltation, it is not. So questions on kind of our general overview of the humiliation and exaltation.
So the Bible doesn't say much about it, or really, I mean, from after his birth and early years, and then until he's 12 years old. So how would this have manifested itself when he was just a kid? I mean,
So, are you saying like so? How is this?
so his divine nature.
Right. So what we can. So you're actually asking that question in an opposite way that most people tend to ask it, which is so Pieper deals quite a bit with the early years of Christ, in the argument of Jesus actually had an early childhood. Right. He actually developed as a child. But you're kind of asking this in the other direction.
Yeah.
Because he had a normal childhood, how would this have played itself out? I'm not entirely sure we can speak a whole lot on this, right? Because we have the nativity,
Right.
assuming, which is a good assumption, right? The wise men scene happened at age 2. We got that. We know he came back at some point, right? And then we have 12 years old and then 30, give or take.
Yeah.
So we really have just
Right.
really small snapshots of what's going on. Although I think what we can do is we can kind of look to the good snapshot we have, or probably the best one for this would be Jesus at the temple.
Yeah.
And we talked about this in the first class, where we see in just those couple of verses that Jesus is confessing that he is both God and man, right? I had to be in my Father's house. He submitted to his mother and father. And so I think that's probably the best way for us to look at this. And so how that applies to the humiliation, right? So the first thing we can say about it, Jesus knows who he is. He knows he's God. He has the divine majesty. He's well aware of that divine majesty. Got to be in my Father's house, right? He still has a normal human development. He's learning there. Now, there are a few different ways people take the phraseology. Some say that he's just teaching everyone. I happen to know an individual who thinks this way. I don't think that that's the best way to read it. I think Jesus, right? I tend to play the biblical narratives out as like movie scenes in my brain. I don't know if anyone else is like that. It's just how I think, right? I see this, the scene of the priests, whoever they are, asking Jesus questions, as right Jewish teaching goes, right? You ask questions in the Jewish tradition, and the way Jesus is answering is blowing their minds, right? Not necessarily in you dummies, this is how it works, right? But this 12-year-old knows way more than he should, and maybe he's saying things that they don't understand too. They're thinking, what's going on here? But such that they are recognizing, this kid really gets it. But he's learning there. He has to learn, right? You don't have 1-year-old Jesus who's explaining the entire Old Testament. This is kind of this human and divine nature, right? He still needs to learn. He still had to memorize Bible verses as a kid. It was easier for him, most certainly. He didn't have the same struggles necessarily that we do, but he still needed to learn. But there is still that. He's aware, other people aren't, that sort of thing. But right, you get those little glimpses of this kid's son's different about him, right? Tom?
Well, I was thinking it is an interesting question because the baby isn't aware of anything.
Right.
He has to eventually, so you kind of wonder, well, when did Jesus know that he was the Son of God? And
I think, and I'm glad I have my theological review here. I think the correct answer to that would be from the moment of conception, he was aware of it, according to his divine nature, right? Jesus can do things normal humans can't. right? He can walk on water, he can walk through walls. Just because he is divine, he's like us in every way except the ways he's not. Kind of.
There's no requirement of him to use any of his majesty until he's 30 years old.
Yeah, so...
But it's an old question. There's apocryphal gospels that suggest he did things like turn clay figures that he had made into living birds and they flew away. And that one of his playmates fell from a tree and broke their arm and Jesus healed him as a child. But that's all apocryphal stuff. Because nature hates a vacuum and they want to fill those years.
Yeah, absolutely. This is neither here nor there, but there's a Jewish tradition. It's actually, they append it to their sacred writing. It's called Midrash. And it is the Jewish authors, essentially, filling in the blank places in Scripture. And they're fascinating stories. They're not, the Jewish people understand that they are not Scripture, right? They teach, they're meant to inform. One of the famous ones is how Joseph got his wives. The most famous Midrash, though, is probably one you all know, although none of the middle schoolers know it, is the Prince of Egypt. The Prince of Egypt can properly be understood as a Midrash. It's a retelling. We don't know anything about Moses' early life, right? It tells us all about him growing up, right? It fills in all these stories. So Midrash can be fun as long as you realize it's not Scripture. So that's a teaching moment right there. But I think the questions of, when was Jesus aware, right? Because babies aren't aware, or fetuses aren't aware, is one of those, it kind of is peeking into the incomprehensible nature of who Jesus is. Did Jesus perform miracles before he was 30? Maybe not. Probably not, because it probably would have been written down. So, right, Mary is the one who, Luke almost certainly interviewed Mary. And she probably would have mentioned them.
I think we can certainly say Jesus believed he was God's Son and trusted his Heavenly Father from his conception, because that's the work of the Holy Spirit. Infants can have.
Yeah.
But he didn't use that. He didn't put that faith into practice until later in his life.
Right. There's still that submission. The will of the Father is that he doesn't begin his ministry until, as the Catholics will tell you, until his mommy said so. But until the wedding at Cana, right? Good questions. We are going to spend a little bit of time specifically on the nativity and very little on the growth. But so good. Anything else before we dive into the actual section on humiliation here? All right, so as we dive into the humiliation, let's just keep in mind that humiliation is more than a simple hiding of divine majesty. It is a true renunciation of it. Right? Jesus is not using all of his divine majesty. It's not simply just covering it up. It's still there. He doesn't lose it. But this is another way of saying it's a real, actual humiliation. Right? It's not just pretending this whole time. And as we go, we're going to really focus on kind of two major units, which will break out in our model. But the first is the conception, the nativity, early life, and then the second is the suffering, death, and burial of Jesus. The conception and the nativity of Jesus. We need to be incredibly careful here. This is probably the most particular place the place where we need to be most particular in the discussion of the humiliation and exaltation of Jesus. Because what is absolutely not the humiliation is the incarnation. It is not the fact that Jesus became man that was his humiliation. Right? This is what we all tend to think. This is a natural thought for all of us, is that, you have God who becomes man. And we're talking about being humiliated, being brought low. That seems to fit, right? Why can we be absolutely certain that the humiliation of the conception, because there is humiliation in the conception, but that it is not the fact that God brought humanity into himself.
Because God created man and loves us?
Okay, so that's a good start. Well, so God created man and he loves us. Okay, but I mean, David is very clear, right? How we are so beneath you, God, right? So we're going in a good direction, but we're not quite there yet.
He gave us our salvation through Christ.
Okay, we're getting real close here, right? It is through the person of Christ that salvation is accomplished. In fact, this is another one of these mini tangents. I heard it as a mini tangent, but it was from Dr. Bierman. So I've not looked it up, but I want to believe it because he seems to know what he's talking about. Maybe chances are Joe's written papers on this whole thing. That seems to be how it goes. In the medieval church, they had a festival day that was the celebration of the Blessed Fall. Where the Blessed Fall, the Adam and Eve falling into sin, where they remembered and celebrated the fact that Adam and Eve fell into sin, which sounds insane. C.S. Lewis picks up on this in Out of the Silent Planet, more so in Paralanter, but Out of the Silent Planet, if you haven't read C.S. Lewis's sci-fi trilogy, go buy it tonight, read it, it's spectacular.
I got it from the library.
Yeah, it's really good. In fact, if you have an Audible subscription, you can listen to it for free. It's on their Prime, whatever it is, Prime Plus catalog, whatever. The reason the medieval church did this, and the reason C.S. Lewis picks up on this, is if it weren't for the fall, Jesus would not have become human. God would not have become man. And that is, God would not have entered into his creation. And what a joyous thing for man, for his creation.
Well, that's
God would
not
become
true because God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden.
Yes. So I'm not saying that he's not involved in creation, but he is not intimately connected to it in the same way.
He was still God.
Yeah, he's still separate and other, right? We talked very early in this class about how one of the ways you define God is that he's not man, right? And God has become man. He has entered into our flesh, to our glory as well. We share the same, we are homoousios with the Son, right? We share the same nature as him now. Let's not go too far with this.
That sounds weak though, because the way they could walk with God in the garden and everything, and he came after they had sinned.
There's also a revealing of God and his mercy and things like that, which wouldn't have happened without the fall. I'm not saying we need to reinstitute this holiday, but it did occur. And this gets to Bill's point of, because of the incarnation, Christ saves. We're still not quite there on how we know absolutely for certain that the incarnation, the taking on of humanity, was not the humiliation. And we've talked about it in this class too.
Were it not for the fall, we would not need the divine nature of Christ.
Yes, you're correct. And now my rabbit hole is getting us off track. So I'm with you, but that is the wrong direction. Let's go down the salvation direction. Well, what happened right after the cross? Resurrection. All right? Describe the person of Christ in the resurrection to me.
His human nature, he was walked among them.
The first words you said there, Bill.
His human nature.
Oh! Did you catch it? So in the resurrection is part of the exaltation. Right? It's not the start, it's part of. And what does Jesus have in his state of exaltation? His human nature. He didn't get rid of it.
Yeah.
And he is exalted now more than he was before. Right? And he still has his human nature. He will eternally have his human nature. And so we know, if the human nature makes it into the exaltation, then it is not what made the conception part of his humiliation. Right? Again, we're cutting a thin line here, but we need to be very careful about this. This also speaks to what the human nature is, which is this first point. It's created by God. It is not only good, it is very good, right? You will have your human nature eternally. Now, the sin will be purged out from it. It will be as it was intended to be, in fact, even better. But you will have your human nature eternally. In perfection, you will have your human nature. There is nothing sullying about the fact of the human nature. The sin which has bound itself to us by our own fault is what drags us down. But we also know, let's not miss this point here, Jesus didn't have that problem, right? The human nature, because, I forget the particular terminology here, right? But because sin is not required, it's not an essential part of the human nature, Jesus can have a complete human nature without sin, right? And again, we made the distinction here with the 1 John passage. It's part of our confession, and it's completely.
We say that we have no sin.
We deceive ourselves, right? We are born sinful. We are by nature sinful, right? That is saying something different than our human nature is essentially sinful, right? That is, we are currently, because we are in a state of sin, we have sin in our nature, right? The reason why it seems like we're mincing words with John is because of the way human language developed. Right, we use these terms to describe these things in a different way than John was. But if we go with what John was intending, and if we go with what the theological terms are intending, it's not as close a gap as it seems. We need to just remember that sin is not an essential part of human nature. So, there we go. That's the second thing that the conception was not the humiliation. Or the second reason why the conception was not the humiliation. So it was not humiliation because Christ took on human nature. And it was not humiliation because that human nature had sinned, because it didn't. Right? The humiliation in the conception was rather that Christ took the form of a servant. Right? Now, I think if I were teaching this to children, we could kind of stick this on the, he was born in a manger. It is getting at it, right? Could have been born in a palace, right? That sort of thing. But that's a very simplistic view of this. What we really mean and what we're really driving at is not that Jesus was born into a life of poverty. That's not it. Even had Jesus been born in a palace and lived a life of luxury, it still would have been humiliating in the sense of submission, because now he is placing himself under the will of the Father, right? He is submitting himself to this work of salvation, which will lead to his death and resurrection. Well, his sufferings and death, eventually resurrection, but that's on the exaltation side. Additionally, being born of Mary, being born as a man, means that Jesus was born under the law, right? So Jesus has to submit himself to the law, right? And he submitted himself to Mary and to Joseph. That is what the humiliation is here. It's not that he's man, but that God needs to submit himself to his own law, right? God needs to submit himself to his own creations. Yet in all of this, I'm losing myself here. Right, so the humiliation of the conception, of the nativity, the birth, even his early life, is that Christ is submitting himself to the will of the Father, to the will of his parents, to the will of the Roman government, to the rule of the temple, all these things, that God is submitting himself to authority. That's kind of probably a better way to think about it is the humiliation of the conception is a fourth commandment sort of issue. Right? He who should be in the top authority is now at the bottom, especially as an infant. He is as low as you can get, right? He's not even a rich infant. He's a poor infant, right? He's got nothing. He's got no station or anything. And that is the humiliation of the conception. And then, of course, in the early life, we recognize that Christ is passing through all stages of our life, so that he might thoroughly heal our corruption, right? So this is kind of similar to the, if it is not assumed, it is not saved, right? Jesus is going through a early growth in life just like you so that he can redeem you as well. Questions on this conception and nativity stage of the humiliation? Joe, any other comments?
You covered it very well.
All right. So next we'll move into kind of the big one, and the more obvious one, I think, is the sufferings, the death, and the burial. This is the culmination of his sufferings and torment. Pieper notes very briefly, and so it's probably worth a brief note here, that the sufferings of Christ do not begin in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right? He suffers throughout his life. Right? He knows what it is to be poor. He has no place to lay his head. He is hungry, he is thirsty, these sorts of things. So, properly speaking, when we say the sufferings of Christ, we're talking about the entirety of his life. That he did live a life of suffering. Right? He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, right? Using Isaiah's imagery there. But, while properly speaking, when we talk about the sufferings of Christ, we're narrowing in on, right, the Passion of the Christ. Garden of Gethsemane to, well, his death, right? And everything he went through in that area. The sufferings, the death, and the burial then are also the moment of salvation. It's the moment in which Christ paid for the sins of the world. Now, I have a note here, and I would like you to make this note because it might help us in a future class that I teach at some point. Yes, it is true. The sufferings, death, and burial of Christ are the moment where Christ paid for the sins of the world. I don't like putting a moment on it. Right? I have lots of church fathers that back me up on this one. And even, I know for a fact because I've heard them talk about it. I know modern Catholic theologians agree with me here as well, and I'm certain Lutheran theologians do as well. Joe is nodding because he knows what I'm about to say. Everything Jesus does is for your salvation. The real fun place where I got to deal with this, well, with Dr. Maxwell, is in St. Cyril of Alexandria's examination of Christ's baptism. It's like 30 pages, and half of it you need a degree in philosophy to understand. Thank God I had someone to explain it to me. But you read through it, and for all that you could understand, if you came into this thing blind, you would think that Jesus could have just disappeared right then and there. He was done with the work of salvation, just in getting baptized. That everything was accomplished for you to be saved. He talks about how in the baptism of Christ, the image of God is restored to man, how you are now able to commune with God once again, that, right, you and God are reconciled in Christ's baptism. He goes, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. He really goes into it. And he's like, we're in like, what, John chapter 3? Like, we're barely into this. Is it even 3? It's probably 2. We've barely started this thing. And already you think, well, I guess I don't need to read the other 700 pages of this commentary because we're done here, right? But we recognize that everything Jesus does forgives you of your sins. Everything that Jesus does is salvation for you, right? Just the fact that Jesus became man lifted you up and forgave your sins. Now, this is not to denigrate or to remove the work on the cross, right? Obviously, that's the big one. That's the key. If it weren't for that, none of what else Jesus did would have mattered, right? So had Jesus disappeared right after the baptism, you would still be in your sins, right? No matter what Cyril says. But because Jesus did die, now we can recognize that the entirety of the work of Christ is for you and for your salvation. It is not just his death. It's a big part of it. It's the key, but I challenge you actually, next time you read a gospel text, this Sunday's is probably not a good one because it's an Ascension text. next time you read just like a narrative about Jesus' life, ask yourself the question, how is this about my salvation? It's somewhere easier. The baptism is an easier place to find it. The wedding at Cana is a harder one, although, guess what? The wedding at Cana, according to Cyril, removed the curse on women, which there's just interesting anecdotal questions about that. But you read through Cyril's examination of the wedding at Cana, and guess what? You take that out of context, and Jesus done everything to save you in the miracle of changing water into wine. Cyril and the church fathers in general see salvation in everything Jesus does. And it's a fun little challenge, right? It's a way to get more insight into Scripture. How is this for my salvation?
Back up on that. What was the purpose of Jesus' baptism?
To save you. So part of it is the fulfilling of the law. Part of it is an institution of baptism. Okay, I'm just going to... It's not going to be outright plagiarism because I'm going to cite it.
There's got to be God's witness about
yeah.
the Son, this medal of the Son.
So, and I have... Well, my vicarage supervisor told, and I use this excuse a lot, has told me that there is no such thing as plagiarism for the sake of the gospel. And I've preached a sermon where I just flat out stole 90% of it from Pastor Brian Wolfmueller. He's out in Austin, Texas. He has a YouTube channel. Go check it out. But don't look at his stuff right before I preach, because I don't always outright rob an entire sermon from him like I did with what I'm about to tell you. But I borrow from him a lot. He's a very intelligent, very pastoral individual. So if you haven't checked out Brian Wolfmueller, this stuff is good.
St. Paul's also.
Yeah. So Wolfmueller's story, because this is why he gets stolen from, by me at least, a lot, is because he has great stories for why Jesus needed to be baptized as this. So imagine you see John the Baptist in a river, beautiful river, crystal clear, cool, right? Everything you want in a river. It's the best river in the world. And on the hill, to one side, there's a flock of sheep. And they are the most disgusting sheep you've ever seen in your life. They're grimy, they're mangy, they're missing wool in places, like broken limbs, open scabs, oil. They are gross. They stink. They're the nastiest looking sheep you've ever seen in your whole life. And man in the water, John the Baptist, says, come for the forgiveness of sins, right? You brood of vipers, all his preaching. And one by one, sheep come down the hill, and John puts them in the water, puts them out on the other side. And as you're watching, a miracle is occurring, because these nasty, disgusting sheep are coming out the other side absolutely beautiful. They are immaculate. I mean, you just want to go shear them right away because of how pristine their wool is. Right? All those scabs are gone. They're not mangy anymore. They smell beautiful. And as John is doing this, the water is getting gross. All that nastiness and filth from the sheep is going into the water. So what was once a beautiful river is now disgusting. And then another sheep comes over the hill that looks even better than those sheep. It is the Platonic ideal of sheep. It is perfect in every way. And it comes down and it says, John, I need you to baptize me. And John says, no! Do you see this river? It's disgusting. Do not get in this river. You're perfect as you are. Stay there. Right? Don't come here. Nope. John baptizes him. Eventually, John gives in, takes the sheep, puts it in the water, and like a sponge, all the disgusting scum and slime and oil gets soaked up into the sheep. John places it on the other side, and now it looks nasty. Broken leg, it's hobbling away, it's coughing, and John points and says, behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So we can say that in the baptism, Jesus, a less dramatic and memorable way to put it, this is actually my vicarage supervisor's image, not his alone, certainly, is that in the baptism, Jesus puts on a backpack that's full of your sins. All the sins, by the way, that you gave him when you were baptized. And he carries that throughout his whole ministry to the cross, where he dies for him. So that's the best answer I have for why Jesus had to be baptized. He is baptized not for his sake, but for yours, so that your baptism might have power and authority. Yes?
Jesus' explanation to John the Baptist is, this is the righteous thing to do. And Jesus always did the righteous thing.
Right, and it's part of the humiliation, right? It is that taking on the sins. It is the submitting himself to the will of the Father, right? And it's a little mini picture of the cross in many ways. Interestingly enough, there's, depending on which gospel you read, it changes, it varies whether or not anyone heard the voice of the Father. Right? This is my beloved Son, in him I am well pleased. In the Gospel of Mark, it's written in the Greek, and he can explain to you how this all works far better than I can. The Greek heavily implies no one heard that except Jesus, which makes it really cool, because who's the only person in Mark who ever figures out that Jesus is God? It's the centurion at the cross who says, surely this man was the Son of God. The only person who figures out who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark is the man who watches him die. You don't know who Jesus is till you watch his work, right? Till you watch the greatest of those works, the culmination, his death on the cross. And the centurion who was there witnessing it firsthand is the only, go back and read through Mark. It's the only person who ever makes the connection, the only human who ever makes the connection that Jesus is God. Now, there are lots of beings yelling about how Jesus is God. Most of them are demons. And you know what the first thing Jesus does when they show up? He doesn't exorcise them. He does that later. He says, shut up. You don't get to tell people. Right? No. But no, only demons and the centurion, and of course, God the Father in the baptism, are the only ones who ever figure out who Jesus is. It's very interesting. But you have to know who Jesus is, you have to watch him die, which is what we're doing right now. So the cross, sufferings, death, the burial are the moment, if you have to select one, or the moment of salvation. We then have this weird thing, this really tough thing, right, that according to his human nature, Christ was abandoned by the Father and suffered the eternal torments of hell upon the cross. This is where I'm going to say a lot of things, and they're the best explanations we have for things because it's what Scripture teaches us, but I can't give you any of the mechanics of how this works. It's just the cry of dereliction, right? That my God, why have you forsaken me? That moment, at least, is one of these real big wrenches that gets thrown into a lot of Christology and Trinitarian theology that we just have to say, don't get it. I confess it, I believe it, it doesn't make sense. At least I have found that. Maybe I'm the only one. But so according to his human nature, Christ was abandoned by the Father. My God, why have you forsaken me? And suffered the eternal torments of hell. This is different than the descent into hell. Right? We're going to spend plenty of time on that. Don't worry, Bill. This is what most people think of when they hear descent into hell. He is actually suffering hell upon the cross. So he is, according to his human nature, abandoned by the Father, and according to his divine nature, he is suffering eternally in the space of just a few moments. This is not the Catholic teaching of the re-sacrifice of the Mass. Although they key into this a little bit, depending on who you talk to and how they talk, they'll say that even now Christ is suffering because he suffered eternally. We would say no, that's not quite right. For Jesus, those few moments on the cross, because he is one of the divine attributes, is eternalness, that those few moments on the cross were the equivalent of an eternity of suffering, which, by the way, is the cost of all your sins, right? To be able to pay the price for everyone's sins, eternal suffering needed to occur. And so, according to his human nature, he is abandoned to the torments of hell. According to his divine nature, he suffers them eternally in the space of a few moments upon the cross. And that is, as I said, the equivalent of all sinners suffering eternally, located in a brief span of human time. So is Christ currently suffering the torments of the cross? No. And again, from what Catholic theologians, I think, waffle on this one a little bit. I think they want to say yes and, or yes and no, but we can absolutely say, no, he is not currently suffering. By the way, you'll sometimes hear me say, we have issues with the Catholic view of communion. It's probably not what you think it is. This is where it stems from, is this eternal suffering, re-sacrifice kind of stuff. It's not as much the transubstantiation thing. I think, maybe Pastor Lucky disagrees, I think we could get over that. I really do. I don't think our view is terribly different than the transubstantiation. It is different, but it's not so different that we need to split the church over it. Eternal suffering, yeah, that one's big enough. But that's for a Lord's Supper class, which is not what we're doing right now. Although we've had a lot of prep for that, so maybe I do need to teach that at some point. We see on the cross full submission. Again, the humiliation you can in many ways correlate to submission. And in the cross we see the full submission to and suffering the punishment of the law. Right? We talked about this in the first class, that Christ fulfills the law in two ways. The first way is that he keeps it perfectly, right? So that's a fulfilling of the law, right? Circumcised on the 8th day, all this kind of stuff, right? Kept the kosher laws, all that. So that's the one way that Christ keeps the law. The other is that he suffers the eternal condemnation, the complete and total condemnation of the law. That's the on behalf, or well, both of them are on your behalf, right? This is the great exchange thing that we've talked about. You get the first portion, Christ keeping the law perfectly, that he gives to you. And then he also takes the backpack of all your sins and suffers the punishment eternally. That's the second thing we are talking about when we say that Christ kept the law. He kept it perfectly, and he kept the punishments, which is a weird grammatical sentence, but I think you are tracking with me on what I mean by that. And on the cross, Christ has full submission to and suffering the punishment of the law. Now, we need to make a note here that even in his abandonment, right, when we say that Christ is abandoned according to his human nature, we say that even in his abandonment and torments of hell, Christ does not despair. Now, what does that word mean?
Doesn't give up.
Okay, so this is what most people would say with despair, and in our world, that's what it means. But this is also a little bit of a Princess Bride moment, where that word doesn't mean what you think it means, right? Where when we say that Christ does not despair, we're not really saying that he doesn't give up. You'll see where that comes from. Despair is, and you'll see this in all sorts of Lutheran prayers, right? Lead us not into despair. Protect us from despair, right? Despair in the 16th century was a very specific sin. It was giving up the faith on your deathbed. So when it says, protect me from despair, it means while I'm dying, don't let me give up the faith. That is what despair is. It is abandoning the faith in the last moments of your life. And so when we say that Jesus did not despair on the cross, you can kind of see where this don't give up, right? You can see how the word has changed over time. We note that on the cross, Christ never gave up his faith, right? Rather, he continues, even as the Father abandons him, to trust in the Father, right? This is the will of the Father. This is the cup he is drinking. Christ at no point loses faith, right, in the Father's plan, right, in this plan of salvation, right. He never abandons this faith in God. The cry of dereliction, then, my God, why have you forsaken me, is not a cry of despair. It is rather a cry. This is great Pieper language here. It's a cry of notice, informing the world of the agonies and coming triumph of Christ. right? So why does Jesus say, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's not him saying, as the adoptionist, God, where'd you go? We had a deal here, right? He's not freaking out. He is telling you, he's preaching a sermon, right, to harken back to the early service of Good Friday when I said, he is telling you, the Father has abandoned me, I am suffering the torments of hell, your salvation is imminent. It's kind of what it is. He's informing you about what's going on.
Some have suggested that in using the opening line,
Right.
he really is praying Psalm 22 right out of hell.
Yes. And so,
and it's my God.
yeah, absolutely, right. I think that's absolutely correct. So, if any of you go to our Tenebra service, in some form, whether collectively or responsibly, speak the words of Psalm 22, which starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? All right, I can count my bones, my enemies are all around me. There are a great number of traditions and speculations that come along with this. The one I like the most is that, right, Christ is praying this psalm out of hell, out of the torments, all of that sort of thing. There are some that suggest that the authors, I can't remember, I think it's Luke, who put my God, why have you forsaken me, are doing a Jewish shorthand, which did happen, where, right, they wouldn't say, and then Jesus spoke Psalm 22. They would just write the first line, and everyone who read that would immediately know the whole psalm. And so they would read that and say, oh, Jesus said Psalm 22. Again, I know someone who thinks that Jesus spoke the entirety of the psalm from the cross. I tend to think that's not quite right. I think Jesus just said the first line. Again, this is angels on the head of a pin sort of thing. Partly, how many of you have been to the Tenebra service? How many of you have said all of Psalm 22? Was it an easy thing to do? I mean, I'm not saying reading is hard, right? But it took physical effort. It is a long psalm. Imagine doing that right before you're dead on the cross, right? That's a lot of effort, especially when, like, the way you die on a cross is from your lungs not working. I think those are a lot of words to put into Jesus' mouth. That's my thoughts. Jesus is also God, so he totally could have said the whole thing, right? He could have managed it. But I think the first line would have been more than sufficient. Everyone there, at least all of the Jewish individuals there, would have immediately called the whole thing to their mind, right? They would have known exactly what he was talking about. Remember, all Jews, by the time they were 12, had the entire Pentateuch memorized. And they're using the Psalms consistently. You don't think they had the Psalms memorized too? By the way, if you went through what we would consider high school, you had everything, or all the prophets memorized. And then if you did the full seminary, or the full college education, the entirety of the Old Testament. We underestimate how much the Jewish people of the first century knew. Remember, if you went to my testamental class, they had compulsory, universal education of their children after Alexandria instituted it near the end of the Jewish dynasty that's escaping my brain right now. But anyway, so the disciples were not just dumb fishermen. They had, at a minimum, the entire Pentateuch memorized. How many of you have the entire Pentateuch memorized? I don't. I don't even have that much content memorized. Maybe if you put everything I've memorized together, but a lot of it are, at least at this point, really dumb children's songs, so not nearly as useful as the Pentateuch. But really, when we get down to it, the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me, is not despair. It's a cry letting us know what's going on. It's Jesus giving us a window into what is happening in his death, really. We then recognize that the final state of the humiliation is the burial. Right? He who created the earth now sleeps inside of it. Right? I mean, the church fathers just go bananas over relations here, right? He who made the trees now is nailed to a tree. It's good. It's really good stuff, and I've definitely done it in my sermons too. It's really good. But he who created the earth is now dead inside of it. Probably if you're curious, how's the burial part of the humiliation? Which I doubt any of you are. Hans Holbein the Younger, who is the best of the Reformation artists, just by two paintings that I really love by him, has a painting which I've now lost the name of. It's like the burial of the Christ, or the dead Christ, or something like that. And it's a picture. It's a painting of Jesus in the tomb, and it's gnarly looking, right? You can see and count all of his bones. It's an impactful image. Do you know it? Yeah, it's in a lot of the Book of Concords. If you bought the reader's edition of the Book of Concord back when I did the small called articles class, go to the place that I know you've all been, the section of pictures near the back. It's in there, along with the best picture ever, which is the allegory of the Old and New Testament, also by Hans Holbein the Younger. Spectacular. Questions about the humiliation? See, I told you guys got this. So let's move into the exaltation, right? Which, of course, if you've been in a Lutheran church for any extent of time, you know the first step of the exaltation is the descent into hell, which sounds counterintuitive, which, it's fitting that it's counterintuitive, because the humiliation in the conception is also counterintuitive, so we need to start both of these off with something that kind of sounds backwards. But we'll sort it out. So the descent into hell. Jesus truly descended into hell sometime between his quickening and his visible resurrection. So sometime after he was made alive, but before anyone saw him. When did that happen? Which of the 3 days? I don't know. How long was Jesus dead in the tomb? I don't know. We're not given those details, right? We say Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days because, as far as we know, he was. It was not. The resurrection had not been witnessed by anyone until that third day. By the way, this is counting days by the reckoning of the Jewish tradition, which is sunset to sunset, or sunset to sunset. Which is how you actually get 3 days, when he dies on Friday and rises on Sunday. This word always pops out of nowhere for me, where someone on Holy Week just comes up and asks me, because they're terrified, right, that no one in the church for 2,000 years has known how to count. And Jesus wasn't in the tomb for 3 days. He was only there for like a day and a half. And it's like, no, it's okay. We just calm them down. But like I said, it usually just pops up out of nowhere in my experience. These people who are really, really worried about this. But it's all good. At some point, Jesus descended into hell. After he rose, or he is now alive, descends into hell. He descends as true God and true man. What was his purpose in the descent into hell? We know this one. It was to announce his victory. And it was also there to give us hope who are long suffering on earth. Pieper says that this is the key to understanding Peter's epistles. When he talks about being long suffering for the sake of Christ, which is where he talks about where this comes into play, right? Because where we get this from is in Peter. The descent into hell is to give us who are suffering hope. Hope of the resurrection. Hope that our suffering will end. The descent was not to give the damned a second chance, right? If you remember my after death class, when you're dead, it's too late. One way or the other. Let's take this as a gospel statement. Once you're dead, you're not going to fall out of the faith anymore. All right. But on the other side, once you're dead, you cannot come to the faith anymore either. That's the law side of that. So Jesus' descent into hell was not to give those people a second chance of, hey, guys, I really did it. You want to come over? No. Once they're damned, that's it. It was not to continue Christ's suffering. This is where, is it the Calvinists? Anyway, there's a church group that that teaches that the ascension into hell was a continuing of the suffering of Christ. How do we know that that's not the case? How do we know Jesus did not descend into hell to continue suffering?
He said so.
Because it was finished.
Yeah, there we go. To tell us that it's finished, I'm done, right? That's about as clear as it can be, right? And remember, we're Lutherans, so we just take the Bible at what it says, right? It may seem logical to us. He's going to hell, he must be suffering. We go, yeah, except he said, I'm done. Okay, right? On the cross, it's finished. No more payment needed to be made in hell, period. So we know, just as we know the human nature, or the taking on the human nature was not the humiliation, we know that the descent into hell was not the humiliation. It is part of the exaltation. It was also not a figurative descent into hell. It was a literal thing. It actually happened. Bill, questions?
Now, how does that give us hope?
Because it's an announcement of Christ's victory. So, I'm glad we talked about Psalm 22. What's the psalm that comes after Psalm 22? When Pastor Jordan was asked about the descent into hell, I was actually here. This was a month or two ago, and I was sitting back and chomping on the counter, right? But I did the good. I'm the associate pastor, so I'm going to let the head pastor. I'm going to let him say his piece. He can call on me if he wants to call on me, and he didn't. But we need to read those psalms together. Because I believe that we don't have one reference to the descent into hell. Now, we have one good reference to the descent into hell. I think Psalm 23 is a supporting text for the descent into hell, right? Which I'm sure all of you know. Yeah. Right? Well, what's going on, right? So you have Psalm 22 on the cross. Psalm 23 is a discussion of what's happening in the descent into hell. Now, it's more than that, right? But the real key here, we can narrow it down really even into one. Although, yea, though I walk through the valley in the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. So that probably is included in here too. But thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Right? Now, there is more going on in Psalm 23 than a commentary on the descent into hell. That's not... A commentary on the descent into hell is not even a primary or probably even a secondary usage of this text. Maybe tertiary, right? So let's not go too crazy about this. But this is a bit of a historical thing, right? We'll do this image because it fits in more than one way of understanding it. When the Romans conquered a territory, what did they do? Right? So when Julius Caesar came back from subduing Gaul, what did he do? Or when Germanicus came back from subduing...
Had a victory lap.
Yeah. Scipio Africanus came back from subduing Africa. What did he do? He had, do you know that, oh, see, where are my Roman historians? Oh, it's hurting me. He had an event.
A feast?
A triumph. A triumph is a very special Roman parade. And you know when Rome starts to go to hell in a handbasket, when anytime any emperor goes out and kicks a sheep, comes back and says, I have triumphed, and then throws himself a triumph, that's when Rome's on the decline. But back when they were having triumphs for real reasons, like subduing all of France, what we do is France now, or defeating Hannibal and all that kind of stuff, the way they would do it is this. There'd be a parade from whatever gate to the Capitoline Hill, right? And first would go the prisoners, right? All the prisoners and the slaves would go first. They'd go walking down, right, looking as pitiful as they can, because if they look extra pitiful, they might get to live through the night, right, just to get to be a slave, which in Rome is not too bad. They go and march to the Capitoline Hill, and they go stand off to the side. And then the captured rulers go through. Same thing. After them comes the conquering army. Followed, last of all, by who? The Caesar. Well, it's not always a Caesar, but you get the idea. The conquering general. The man of honor, if you will. The one for whom the triumph is being held. He would go to the Capitoline Hill riding on a 4-horse chariot wearing a crown of laurels, not the crown of grass. That's a whole different thing. It's the only honor higher than a triumph is the crown of grass, but I can tell you about that later. Wearing a crown of laurels, he would come in last. He would take his seat in front of the temple of Mars, right, the god of war, and he would sit there while everyone was celebrating. And then what would they do? Well, they'd take all the leaders out. Well, and depending on when it was in Roman history, early in the Republic, they would then march the leaders into a dark cell, strangle them, and throw them in the river, because they didn't even get the honor of a public execution. Later on, they would execute them in front of, they would execute all the rulers in front of the conquering general, right? Which, I mean, again, look at the submission there, right? We beat you so badly, we didn't even need to kill your rulers over there. We beat you so bad, we could pick them up, take them back to our place, walk you down Main Street, and then kill you, right? I mean, just the authority and the grandeur. That's kind of what the descent into hell is, right? This is the prepare a table, right? Jesus has beaten his enemies so badly he can go to their fort, right? He can go to their capital city and have dinner, just sitting there without worrying about it. It's this proclamation of his victory. That is, which is also why we use the triumph image, because it really works. How many of you have read Dante's Inferno? Oh, only one. So after you're done with the space trilogy, go read Dante's Inferno. Purgatorio and Paradosi are not nearly as interesting. They're good, but they're not that great.
Also inaudible.
Yeah, yes, and you can get them all as one collected unit. But, I mean, you should read the Inferno just for the imagery. Ignore everything else and the fact that it really is a gossip rag. Ignore all of that. Dante is a master of imagery. But when Virgil and Dante, right, so the story is Virgil guiding Dante through hell, the 9 circles of hell, and he's seen all these people. Surprisingly, most of them are from Florence, and wouldn't you know, Dante just got exiled from Florence. It's a weird coincidence, right? It's I know why you're going to hell, I know why you're going to hell, right? And now we're reading it hundreds of years later. But when Virgil and Dante get to this apocryphal city of Dis, the grand fortress of hell, it's in ruins. The whole thing is crumbling. He could tell this used to be a great fortress, an amazing citadel, right? The walls, but they're all crumbling and cracking, and he's like, I can just walk through the gate. And some demons try and stop him, and then angels come, and some weird stuff happens. But Dante asks Virgil, he's like, what's going on here? And Virgil says, I have no idea. I've been down here before. It did not look like this last time I was here, right? And then he goes, oh, this probably happened when Jesus came through, right? And he smashed up the place, right? I mean, he doesn't say it. He says it far more poetically, and he doesn't outright say it. He alludes to it because it's a poem. You got to use allusions, right? But yeah, Dante is explaining, confessing the descent into hell. That Jesus came through with this victory parade, and he just smashed the place up because so great was his victory over it. And then he, imprisoned the 3-headed Satan waist deep in Lake Kolkikis, the frozen lake at the center of hell, right? I mean, go read Dante's Inferno. It's so good. It is terrible for theology, right? I mean, this is probably the only good part of theologically. I mean, it's bad. The theology of the Divine Comedy is not good. But the imagery is just spectacular. And it's still fun to read. So that's what's going on. That's why this is Exaltation. Any other questions on the descent into hell?
Well, in 1 Peter 3:19, it says, in which he also went, made proclamation to the spirits now in prison, who were once disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the day of Noah. So I'm wondering, is his victory proclamation to Satan and his devils? Or maybe not in hell yet? Or is it to the people who didn't believe and are already dead. It seems like a strange proclamation of victory.
I think the answer is yes. So I gave you the long version. Do you know Pastor Jordan's version of his explanation to the descent into hell? I mean, right? His is shorter. It's probably more memorable too. Although I know he's done it for all of you, and none of you did it, so maybe it wasn't as memorable. In the end, this is an unclear portion of Scripture. Right? We don't have a great amount of details about it, and this is a place where we got to say, this is what we know about it, this is what we don't know about it, and we kind of just have to deal with it. So, is it a strange sort of proclamation?
It isn't clear. It's just surprising then that it shows up in the Apostles' Creed.
Well, that was Bill's question, is why does it show up in the Apostles' Creed?
That's pretty prominent to be in the Creed.
And I gave him a long-winded answer for that. Someone thought it was important enough, and for 2,000 years the church has agreed. And the Holy Spirit has seen no reason to kick it out. Which there are lines in creeds that haven't made it 2,000 years, right? There are more creeds than the Apostles, the Nicene, and the Athanasian, right? We talk about the Chalcedonian Creed, which there are Baptist churches up the road who confess the Chalcedonian Creed. Nothing wrong with it. We agree with it, right? We're an ecumenical church body, so we're cool with that. We could, but we don't. And there's there's a Roman Creed that kind of became the Apostles' Creed.
A couple of years ago, I went with friends that I was staying with, and I went to their church, which happened to be a Methodist church, and they said the Apostles' Creed, but omitted.
Yes.
Yeah.
That has been a trend recently. I think it's a bad one. I have a very dear friend from high school, and he keeps trying. He's kind of non-denom sort of background. So anytime he does anything traditional, he always thinks I'm going to be so proud of him. He's like, we confessed the Apostles' Creed in church today. I said, all right. He said, of course, we left out the descent into hell. I said, I don't like that too much. The best one, though, bless his heart, right? I'm in the South, I can say this, right? He was a pastor for a little while. Actually, know what he's doing right now, and he was so excited. Jacob, you're so proud of me. During communion today, guess what? We said the words of institution. He was so happy, and I said, Nate, what? He kind of looked at me funny. I said, you don't always say the words of institution? Like, it was a weird thing for them. Anyway, he was so close. So close. But anyway, that's I'm going to make a Lutheran of him before he dies. I know that for sure. He's getting there. Baptism's still a hang-up for him, which I don't understand. He reads the Bible. So anyway. Sent into hell, resurrection is next. We can kind of get through these pretty quickly. Here's our section. This is why I got lines written on here. Here's our section where we're actually going to read some Bible verses. Shocker. I need one individual to read out of Romans chapter 6 and another John chapter 2. I'm wondering if that should be first, John. There's John chapter 2. This makes sense to me. Oh, no, okay. Okay. So yes, John chapter 2 and Romans chapter 6. So I have one individual for John chapter 2, and you got Romans 6 or John 2?
John 2.
Okay, and then someone else for Romans 6. I want to read them back to back. Romans 6, so I want John 2, just read 19 to 21, and then I'll give you the verses when we get to you, Steve.
All right. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
All right. And then Steve, Romans 6:4.
We were buried therefore with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life.
All right. Who raised Jesus from the dead? Steve, what does yours say?
Mine says by the glory of the Father.
The glory of the Father raised Jesus from the dead. What about yours, Jeff? Look at verse 19.
19.
Yeah.
Jesus answered them to destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.
All right, who's doing the verbs?
Jesus.
Oh. Who raised Jesus from the dead? Did the Father or did Jesus? Yes. The answer is yes. And this is one of those, right, yeah. This is one of those places where the Bible speaks in both ways. And so, unlike the Calvinists, we don't just pick the one we like more. We say they're both true. The Father raised Jesus from the dead, and Jesus raised himself from the dead. And we can take very slightly different lessons from each of these, right? Which we should do, because if the Bible is putting both of them in there, there's a reason, right? And so when we say that the Father raised Christ from the dead, Romans chapter 6, we're recognizing that the Father declares the sins of the world have been fully atoned for, right? You'll hear this distinction if you're careful listening in sermons. When we talk about how Jesus' resurrection is proof that the sins of the world are atoned for, the Father raises Jesus from the dead, right? The Father is justifying the work of Christ. You know your sins are forgiven because the Father raised Jesus from the dead, right? He saw his work and saw it worthy. The sacrifice was enough, that sort of thing. When we talk about how Christ raised himself from the dead, we're recognizing the full proof of Christ's deity. Who can raise people from the dead? God. Who can raise themselves from the dead? God. Annabeth, can you raise yourself from the dead?
No.
That'd be quite a trick. Only God can do that. So when we are emphasizing the deity of Christ, we tend to say Jesus rose himself from the dead. Right? This is to tear this temple down, and in 3 days I will build it up. Jesus, right, called his shot. In fact, the book club, I think, Tom, you were in the book club years ago, we read a book, Did the Resurrection Happen? And one of the key proofs for the deity of Christ is he said he was going to die, he said he was going to raise himself from the dead in 3 days, and then he did it. Who can do that? Only God, right? Other notes for the resurrection, we can kind of go through this quickly. Jesus rose in the same body. Right? The same body that died is the one who rose. Where do we see that? He's got holes in his hands, right? Here's an interesting one. The stone needed not be rolled away so that Christ could leave the tomb. Rather, the stone being rolled away is a declaration to the world. In fact, it seems that Christ was not in the tomb when the stone was rolled away. He was already gone. But it is rolled away not for Christ's benefit, but for ours. Questions on the resurrection? Not true. We're going to go very briefly through the Ascension because tomorrow is Ascension Day, which is exciting. And I'm going to preach on it on Sunday, so you'll get this lesson on Sunday. So now you're actually going to have to listen to the sermon. You won't be able to just ignore the whole thing. But I got to love this, right? We spent an entire day in seminary talking about what the Ascension looked like, right? So what did it look like, right? Everyone sees the pictures, right, of Jesus gently rising up into the sky, right? There's an old tradition, and I'm remembering now, I had intended to find a picture of it. There's a rock in the Middle East that has what looks like a footprint on it. And the idea is, the tradition around this rock is that that's the rock Jesus ascended from, a la Neo in the Matrix, right? Crouch, full blast up, and he pushed off the rock so hard it left his footprint there. I don't think that's cool. Maybe, right? Could have been, but who knows? I tend not to think that Jesus did the Superman Neo from the Matrix thing. I tend to go with the pictures, right, that were taken of him there, of him gently rising. Who knows? And then Pieper has just a great quote here, right? The upward movement was true, but only for our benefit and for, here's the quote, the pleasure of the Savior. It pleased Jesus to ascend. He could have just disappeared, right? But he did so for two reasons. One, so the disciples didn't completely freak out, and that we know that he ascended, right? And two, because he wanted to, is essentially what Peter says. What's the purpose of the ascension? And I'm just going to give you the list here because this is going to be my sermon on Sunday. Jesus ascended into heaven to take his throne, to be with his saints in paradise, and to serve as our great high priest advocating for us before the Father. That last one in particular we're going to talk about next week as well. So he ascended to take his throne, to be with his saints in paradise, and to serve as our great high priest. It's like the whole first half of the book of Hebrews in that last one there. The next are questions on the ascension, which I probably won't answer. I'll just add them to my sermon. I'll say, Steve, this part's for you. Seated at God's right hand. Designates not a special location, right? So we talked about this last week too. Not a special location in somewhere, but the sitting at the right hand of God indicates the unending dominion of Christ our King. And I about threw the book across the room when I read this word, because it's the word I was trying to bring to mind all of last week during this conversation. It's an anthropomorphism. That's when I was struggling to talk, when I was saying, God's not a chicken or a hen and all of that, he's not a door, right? It's an anthropomorphism. The right hand of the Father is just an anthropomorphism of his unending dominion as Christ our King. He is now sitting upon a throne of divine power. He sits as our mediator, our head, our king, and our high priest. And as Pieper notes, he is not in retirement. He is still working even to this day. And the last section of the Exaltation is the judgment of the living and the dead. And I cannot tell you how convenient this was, because Pieper has a very short section on this. Surprisingly short, because he says, this properly concerns eschatology. I'll talk about it later. I mean, he doesn't quite say it that way, but he does. And guess what you guys are talking about on Sundays? Eschatology. And guess whose office I walked into the second I read that and said, hey, did you talk about Jesus returning to earth? And he said, yes. So, go watch Pastor Jordan's classes. He will talk about the coming to judge the living and the dead. The very quick version is that this is a universal proclamation of Christ's victory, even to unbelievers. Look at that every knee shall bow text, right? That's law and gospel. If your knee is bowing for the first time to Jesus, metaphorically speaking, that's a big law. That's bad. But if you've been bending your knee to Christ, this is a wonderful thing, right? This is the greatest joy. We have no eraser. We'll close very briefly with your little chart on the back. So what we can do is actually overlay this lesson onto the creed, which I think is a very good way to do it. How many steps down do we have? All right, I think that's enough, and I'm way over halfway, so we're just going to figure it out, right? So think of it this way. This is a staircase of glory, if you will. And so as we work our way through the creeds, we can say that Jesus was conceived, suffered, died, and was buried. There's one too many. Ooh, perfect. It might actually fit there. And that is the humiliation in a nutshell. right? He was conceived, he suffered, he died, and he was buried, right? We're watching as the glory of Christ is going down, right? Now, granted, this is the visible glory to the world, right? We talked about that already. Then, right, this is the first section of the second article, first section, second article, Apostles' Creed. Then we have the Exaltation, right? So he descended into hell. He rose again. He ascended. Wow, that is seated at the right hand.
Am I not drawing enough?
No, he goes up one more. And now he is coming again. Right? And notice he has more glory than he began with. Right? So Christ is glorified above his station before the incarnation. It's probably not the best way to have said that. But Christ has more glory after his work than he did before.
On your diagram, you got one too many steps down.
Do I? It fit for me. Maybe I did. Anyway. Yeah. Oh, I forgot crucified.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. There we go. Crucified. Died and was buried. I knew something was wrong there. So he suffered, crucified, died, and was buried. There we go. That maps with the creed. So again, every time you say the creed, you can recognize, now we're talking about the humiliation. Now we're talking about the exaltation. Now, there's a tradition associated with this, which one of my supervisors did, and he made me do it, and I have not done it since then, mostly because I forget. And that is that while saying the portion of the creed, which relates to the humiliation, you bow. Right? So when you're saying that portion of the creed, it's not a full thing, but you just go forward a little bit. And then when you get to descended into hell, you can come back up. I said, it's kind of like crossing yourself at the end of the creed with life, which again, that's like the one place in church I very rarely cross myself because I get to life and I go, oh, I was supposed to cross myself. In my mind, if I'm reminded of it in the moment, I'm not going to do it. That's just me. But that is a tradition that you can incorporate into your worship to remind yourself of the humiliation and the exaltation of Christ, if you so choose. I won't be watching you to see if you're doing it on Sunday, mostly because there's a good chance I won't remember to watch you. Because for whatever reason, this doesn't stick in my brain, but I did get in trouble for it over field work because I kept forgetting to do it. And he said, my supervisor, to his credit, said he didn't actually care, but for the sake of the congregation, just be consistent with his name.
First and second article are humiliation.
No, so this is how convenient. So the first article, and this goes for both creeds. I'm just going to run through the Apostles' Creed. So what it would look like, right? I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. That's on the first person of the Trinity. Nothing. And in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead, ascended into heaven, sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From thence he will come to judge the living and the dead. So you recognize that in the second article of the Creed, it fits this pattern of the humiliation and the exaltation. Which is, quite frankly, probably why we talk about this so much when we talk about the work of Christ, because it's written into our creed.
I've seen a musical setting of the creed in which you sing the first article in the major key and all of the humiliation in a minor key, and then return to the major key for the exaltation.
You know, last Sunday, I don't know what brought it up. Maybe it was that this class is in mine. Over Vicarage, I preached a sermon, and I decided to do it on humiliation and exaltation. I freaked everyone out. They didn't have a pulpit. Their tradition at my vicarage congregation was to preach from the front of the chancel. And I started behind the altar. And I talked about the conception of Christ and Then I moved to the front of the altar, where I normally should have been for the suffering. And then by the time I talked about the burial of Christ, I was in the narthex. I walked out, and it was like I said, a lot of people came up to me and said, I thought you were running for it. This is also near the end of my vicarage, so they thought I was just done. And then I came back in for the Exaltation, right? It's kind of to visually represent it. And now, because I did think, I should do that again. So if I do it again, you'll know. You'll really think of this class, but it's a small enough group that I can still do it, I think. But I gotta figure out where I'd be for everything. But good. Any closing questions? All right, we'll meet again next week where we'll look at the threefold office of Christ. Let us close then, as is tradition here, with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you so much. This one went long, so thank you especially for sticking it out.
I just wanted to say publicly, your explanation last week, the best explanation of the three genus theology that I've ever heard.
Oh, I will say, when you walked in, I considered asking you what you thought of last week, but was worried. So, thank you.
It was the only one I'd ever heard.
Yeah, but that comment means more coming from him, doesn't it?
I can top that. You know, I dreamed about this triangle you drew with Christ, God in the center, and
Oh, really?
I did.